Hello everyone, and welcome back to LouLou True Crime. My name is Lou, and this is the channel where we explore the world's most fascinating crimes, shocking mysteries, and criminal stories from across the globe. If you enjoy true crime that goes deeper than the headlines, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because some of the darkest stories in history are still waiting to be uncovered. Tonight's story is one of the most chilling cases in American criminal history, not just because of the violence, but because of how ordinary the killer appeared. He was a husband, a father, a churchgoer, a working professional. Yet behind that normal exterior was someone who called himself BTK: bind, torture, kill. The name alone tells you everything about the psychology involved. It wasn't just about murder. It was about control, domination, and recognition. And for decades, this killer managed to live undetected in plain sight. To understand how this case began, we need to go back to Wichita, Kansas, in the early 1970s. It was considered a safe, quiet Midwestern city where people trusted their neighbors and crime rarely dominated headlines. That sense of security was shattered in January 1974 when four members of the Otero family were murdered inside their own home. Joseph and Julie Otero, along with two of their children, Joseph Jr. and Josephine, were killed in a calculated attack that shocked the community. There was no sign of robbery, no obvious personal motive. Investigators quickly realized they were dealing with someone organized, deliberate, and emotionally detached. The offender had brought materials with him, controlled the victims methodically, and left with minimal evidence. These details suggested planning rather than impulsive violence. At first, police struggled to establish a clear suspect pool. Nothing pointed to someone close to the family. It appeared random, and that randomness made the crime even more frightening. Then, months later, something unprecedented happened. A local newspaper received a letter from someone claiming responsibility for the murders. The writer provided specific details that only the killer could know, leaving little doubt about authenticity. He demanded recognition. He wanted the public to know what he had done, and he signed the letter with three letters that would soon terrify Wichita: BTK. The public reaction was immediate. Residents began locking doors more carefully. Parents warned children about strangers. A sense of unease settled over the city. But the violence didn't end there. In April 1974, Catherine Bright was attacked in her home. She was killed, while her brother survived and managed to give police a description of the attacker. That survivor testimony helped investigators confirm their suspicion. The killer was likely local, familiar with the area, and confident enough to operate close to home. Yet despite increased police presence and media attention, the offender remained unidentified. Then came another twist. The murders appeared to stop. Months passed, then years, without confirmed attacks linked to BTK. Some investigators wondered if the killer had moved away, been imprisoned for another crime, or possibly died. But the earlier letters suggested someone who craved attention. Silence didn't quite fit that profile. During those years, Dennis Rader, later revealed as BTK, lived what appeared to be a normal life. He married, had children, held steady employment, and participated actively in church activities. Eventually, he worked as a compliance officer, enforcing local municipal codes. It was a position that gave him authority and interaction with the public. Looking back, that contrast between normal public life and hidden criminal behavior remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. Then, in 1977, the killings resumed. Shirley Vian was murdered inside her home while her children were present in another room. The emotional impact on the community was immense. Fear intensified. People began altering routines, installing better locks, and paying closer attention to unfamiliar activity. Later that same year, Nancy Fox was killed. After the murder, the killer phoned police himself to report it, calmly, almost routinely. That call reinforced what investigators suspected. Attention and psychological control were central motivations. The late 1970s became a period of heightened anxiety in Wichita. Residents understood that the threat hadn't disappeared. It had simply gone quiet. And once again, after those murders, the killer seemed to vanish. Years turned into decades without confirmed BTK crimes. The case remained open but gradually cooled. Advances in forensic science were still developing, and many investigative tools available today simply didn't exist. DNA profiling hadn't yet become standard. Digital databases weren't in place. Communication between jurisdictions was slower. These limitations made solving long-term serial cases especially difficult. Despite the silence, investigators never fully abandoned the case. Evidence was preserved, files maintained, and occasional leads followed. Meanwhile, Dennis Rader continued living an outwardly ordinary life, working, raising a family, attending church, and blending into his community. Friends, co-workers, and neighbors later described him as polite, responsible, even helpful. No one suspected the hidden reality. That duality, ordinary public persona versus violent secret life, would later become central to understanding the psychology of the BTK killer. Experts believe he derived satisfaction not only from the crimes themselves, but from successfully maintaining that double identity. Control extended beyond victims to perception itself. For Wichita residents, the lingering uncertainty never completely disappeared. Even years later, some people remained cautious, remembering the fear that had once gripped the city. Because unresolved cases leave something behind, questions without answers. And in this case, those questions would persist for decades. But what no one knew at the time was that the story wasn't over. Because decades later, the BTK killer would resurface, not through another murder, but through communication. And that decision, reaching out again, would ultimately lead to his downfall. Investigators kept the case open, but with no new evidence, momentum slowed. For many residents, BTK became a terrifying chapter they hoped was closed forever. But in 2004, that illusion ended. A local newspaper received a package referencing the original murders. It included crime details, photographs, and communications clearly linked to the earlier letters. BTK was back. The timing shocked investigators. Nearly 30 years had passed since the last confirmed killing. Most serial offenders don't re-emerge after such a long silence. This wasn't about continuing violence. It appeared to be about recognition, legacy, and control over the narrative. The killer wanted attention again. Letters began arriving regularly. Some included puzzles, cryptic messages, and symbolic references. Others contained items connected to earlier crimes. Each message confirmed what profilers had long believed. BTK craved acknowledgement as much as he craved domination. Law enforcement responded differently this time. Technology had advanced dramatically since the 1970s. DNA analysis was now a major investigative tool. Digital forensics allowed new forms of evidence tracking. Investigators saw an opportunity. Instead of discouraging communication, they subtly encouraged it. The hope was simple. If BTK kept reaching out, he might make a mistake. And eventually, he did. In one exchange, the killer asked police whether a floppy disk could be traced. Authorities responded publicly that it could not. It was a strategic answer. Soon after, a disk arrived. Digital forensic analysts examined it carefully. Deleted files were recovered. Metadata pointed toward a church organization and a specific username. That name led investigators to Dennis Rader. Suddenly, the ordinary church-going compliance officer became the prime suspect in one of America's longest-running serial murder investigations. Surveillance began quietly. Investigators collected discarded items for DNA comparison. Family DNA helped confirm the link when matched against biological evidence preserved from earlier crimes. After decades of uncertainty, the identity of BTK was finally confirmed. Dennis Rader was arrested in February 2005. The news stunned Wichita. Co-workers, neighbors, and church members struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the crimes revealed. Many described disbelief bordering on shock. How could someone appear so normal while hiding such violence? During interrogation, Rader confessed calmly and in detail. His demeanor was methodical, almost clinical, as he described each crime. He showed little outward emotion. That composure reinforced psychological assessments, suggesting a strong need for control, recognition, and narrative ownership. In court, his testimony was equally chilling. He described planning attacks, stalking victims, and the rituals he associated with his crimes. For families, hearing those details was deeply painful, but it also provided long-awaited answers. Ultimately, Rader pled guilty to 10 murders. The plea avoided a trial but ensured life imprisonment without parole. Kansas did not have the death penalty applicable in his case, so multiple life sentences were imposed. For victims' families, the sentencing brought mixed emotions. There was relief that he could never harm anyone again. But closure is complicated when trauma spans decades. Many express that justice doesn't erase loss. Psychologists studying the case often highlight the dual life phenomenon. Rader maintained employment, family relationships, church involvement, and community responsibilities while committing murders. That contrast fascinates criminologists because it challenges assumptions about visible warning signs. Some offenders integrate into society more seamlessly than expected. The BTK case also reshaped investigative practices. Evidence preservation proved critical. Biological samples saved decades earlier ultimately enabled identification. Without that foresight, solving the case might have been impossible. Media strategy lessons also emerged. Investigators learned how offender communication can be leveraged strategically rather than purely reactively. Controlled engagement sometimes produces actionable mistakes. The case also reinforced public awareness about forensic technology. DNA genealogy, digital forensics, and behavioral profiling gained broader recognition, partly due to high-profile cases like this. But beyond investigative advancements, there's a human dimension that must remain central. Behind every case file were real people, families whose lives changed permanently. Victims weren't statistics. They were parents, children, friends, neighbors. Remembering that human cost is essential in true crime storytelling. If you're finding this story compelling, this is a good moment to like the video, subscribe to LouLou True Crime, and share it with others who appreciate thoughtful true crime content. It genuinely helps the channel grow and allows more deep dive stories like this one. The BTK case remains one of the clearest examples of how persistence, evolving technology, and investigative strategy can intersect over time. Cold cases aren't always unsolvable. Sometimes they simply wait for the right tools. Still, the psychological questions linger. What drives someone to maintain a double life for decades? How does recognition become intertwined with violence? And why risk exposure after getting away with it for so long? Those questions don't have simple answers, but they remind us that criminal behavior often involves complex psychological motivations beyond immediate gain. For Wichita, the arrest brought resolution but also reflection. Communities revisited assumptions about safety, trust, and how well we truly know the people around us. That reflection is uncomfortable but necessary, because cases like BTK aren't just about crime history. They're about understanding human behavior, investigative evolution, and the importance of vigilance without paranoia. And perhaps most importantly, they remind us to center victims rather than offenders whenever possible. Their stories deserve dignity beyond the notoriety of those who harmed them. As true crime continues growing in popularity, responsible storytelling matters more than ever. Accuracy, empathy, and perspective help ensure these stories inform rather than simply entertain. The BTK case ultimately ended with accountability, but decades later than anyone hoped. And that delay shows both the limits and strengths of justice systems over time. Thanks for watching LouLou True Crime. More true crime deep dives, unsolved mysteries, serial killer cases, heists, and criminal psychology stories are coming regularly. And until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, sometimes the most unsettling criminals aren't the ones hiding in shadows. They're the ones hiding in plain sight.